We start with Jürgen Weibull speaking of morality. So you have 45 minutes and we'll have 5 minutes of discussion at the end. So my role will be very minimum. So I think everyone is free to ask questions as they wish or during the talk. Or.
Bonjour tout le monde. On m'a demandé de donner ma présentation en français. Non, c'est une blague. I will spare you from my poor French, and you will suffer from my Swedish-style English instead. So first of all, I would like to congratulate all of you who have created this place, the PEC. I remember the time before year zero. Okay, can you hear me now? So I would like to congratulate you who have created this school, and it was mentioned the 10 first years. I remember a time before the year zero also. Some of us do, and in those days one could go to Paris and there would be wonderful researchers. Great research was done, but in small groups. And there was a steady loss of talented people to the US, and it was not a critical mass anywhere really. There was this Monday seminars, Le Roi, where everybody was meeting, but otherwise it was too little meeting, and then this was created, and I think that's a fantastic achievement. So I'm very happy for that, and also I'm feel very honored to be here to talk with you at this occasion, for which I'm very happy. The topic is on the title here, Morality, Evolutionary Foundations, Experimental Evidence, and Economic Implications. So there are questions about morality, which are now in the headlines because of the state of our countries, our economies, and so on. But that is not why we started to work on this. We came from a completely different angle. So Ingela and I have been doing research on this topic for some years. So here are some papers. But we started with another paper, another topic actually. We wanted to understand family ties, altruism between related individuals from a biological and economics viewpoint, so the economics of the family, if you like. And when we did that, we came up with results that could show that Sweden has weaker family ties, in theory, than, say, Italy, or living in a milder climate. And that was run contrary to what biology said. So biologists were quite surprised, because there is Hamilton's rule in biology, which says that you should give the weight 1/2 to your sibling, compared to with yourself. A positive weight of 1/2, because the probability that you have a rare gene that you might have is with your sibling is 1/2. So it shouldn't vary with the environment. We showed it doesn't vary, and that was because we endowed our agents with cognitive abilities, unlike in biology. So we imagined that if you are a very nice sibling, you might be exploited by less nice siblings. And then we solve for equilibrium in preferences and in behavior. Now, that was a situation when individuals would know each other. Siblings, I would argue, if anybody knows anybody, I mean, siblings would be one case where we could say, okay, you know that the goal function, the preferences, and the weaknesses and strengths and so on of your siblings. However, there is an issue, of course, of the commitment value of preferences then. So if a person is very bullish, and we know that, and I think of a certain president in a certain country, then others who are rational might have to back out, and maybe the bully will gain from the reputation. So we wanted also to analyze situations when there is no such possibility, which means incomplete information. So we imagine situations where you cannot use your type to threaten or invite others to exploit you. But your type, your preferences, if you like, your moral values would be your private information. Can anything be said then? Or is it the case that natural selection, a la Darwin, will sort out everybody who has any concern for other people, and we only get selfish people who survive? That was the question we asked. And here are some of the papers, and I will try to give an overview of some of the main ideas in this research. So the approach we use is called the indirect evolutionary approach. So it doesn't directly look at selection of genes or behavior patterns or phenotypes, as they are called in biology, but we think of evolution as working at a higher level. So evolution is selecting goal functions, if you like, designing individuals like humans with cognitive capacity so that it delegates to the individual to do what the individual finds appropriate given the information at hand. So instead of programming behaviors for all situations, it designs, we imagine, a goal function. This is very much like in modern artificial intelligence, when you make robots and you give them goals. and then they learn things. Our models are, of course, much simpler than computer scientists' model. We focus more on the goal functions than on the algorithmic implementation. So there are three things that we want to understand then. First of all, what can we say? If we start from scratch, without any prejudice, we don't say that people are necessarily materialistic or selfish or anything. We make the weakest possible assumptions about individuals' preferences. Then we have to make an evaluation of how do they fare when they interact with each other. And when they interact with each other, that will be game theory that comes in there. And we actually got the surprising results for us. So we thought first, I thought we had made miscalculations because it fell out so easily at the end that we were double checking many times the calculations and ran some simulations, and everything seems to hang together. So I think it's right. And then we also wanted to see, can we find any traces of this new class of preferences, which had not been known before, in laboratory data? So we dug out some data that I had done with Ernst Fehr and Michael Kosfeld back in Zurich, and we ran his model, the Fehr-Schmidt model, against our model. I will not tell you what was the end result of that yet. And then I will speculate about implications. What happens if we would replace Homo economicus in our analysis by what we call Homo Moralis, which means individuals are motivated partly by self-interest, partly by morality, a la Immanuel Kant? Would that change our policy? Would that change how people behave? That's the third question. Of course, these are too many things to go into any detail, so I will just make a short survey of that. So the evolutionary part first, then experimental part, and then the policy part. The evolutionary part starts out from a classical biological framework, a very strictly, strongly simplified, mathematical, workable environment. So imagine a very large population of individuals who now and then randomly match with each other, and then they can interact. It can be public goods, it can be bargaining, it can be competition, it can be many things. Let little n be the number of people who meet, so we will talk about n-player games when they meet. And suppose then that that results in some material consequences, like profits if it's firms, money or some form of health or utility, something which we take as a given now. So there will be some given function which we will denote by pi for payoff, and we call it material payoff, because we imagine this is the underlying forces like profits or utility for consumers, standard utility from effort, work, and consumption and so on. Okay, and in order to get some handle on this, we have to make one assumption, and that will be essentially the only one, I think, which is significant, and that is that the interaction is aggregative. And the following way. So there are n people meeting now to interact, maybe public goods, maybe in competition. We assume then that the material outcome for an individual depends on his or her strategy in the interaction and on the strategies of the others, of course, but in such a way that it doesn't matter if, among the others, I replace one guy's strategy by another guy's strategy, so I switch between them. So Anderson is doing what Svensson did before. That shouldn't matter. So the material outcome for me is permutation invariant with respect to the other guys, not with myself. So this is, for example, the case in, say, Cournot competition. The aggregate output of the other firms, that's what matters, not which firm does what. In Bertrand also, it's the highest or lowest price, if it's Bertrand, that matters for me, not who said that lowest price, and so on. Public goods, usually also we contribute to something, and then the sum of money is put on the table, and we do something for the money. So that is the class of interactions that we can handle. Now, otherwise, we don't make any particular assumption about the game. So it can be a one-shot game, like a prisoner's dilemma, if you like, but it can also be a game that is very complicated with lots of asymmetric information, if you like. But it should have this structure. So we start out, and then somebody learns something and does something, and then other guys observe that, and it can go on for as long as you like. We make very weak assumptions. The only assumption mathematically is that there exists a normed vector space in which we can embed the strategies. So it can be infinitely repeated even. So that is the setup. Now, we imagine that everybody in this world that we imagine is endowed with some utility function, some function which represents the person's preferences, what strategy to choose in a given interaction. So there is a function pi coming up. Now I'm interacting with these people. How much will I contribute to the public good, and so on. The only assumption we make is that these goal functions that people have in their heads subjective, if you like, they are continuous function of strategy profiles. That's all. No other assumption. We don't assume it has anything to do with material outcomes. It could be that I don't care about what I earn. I care about what some other people earn. I care about the average. Maybe I'm spiteful, so I care about the difference. I always want to earn more than others. Maybe I'm altruistic. Maybe I have some moral principles, so I always want to do what I think is the right thing. All that is allowed. No assumptions there. And as people walk around in this world that we imagine, their preferences is their private information, okay? So then you match with people, you don't know who has what preferences. How shall we then evaluate how well they fare? Well, we use then an idea which is old in evolutionary biology, namely evolutionary stability of strategies as developed by these two gentlemen, two eccentric British gentlemen, John Maynard Smith and George Price. In 1973, they wrote an article in Nature where they defined the idea of evolutionary stability of behaviors, a paper which has become very important, and there is a whole literature on this field now. So the idea here is that suppose there is some interaction among animals or plants or humans, and they look at strategies when these animals or plants or humans interact with each other, and they say, okay, here is a strategy which looks very promising. Can it survive invasion by a small group of other organisms or individuals who have some other strategy, by migration or perturbation of the population or some mutation in the population? So most people do something when they interact, some particular behavior in that interaction, and then we imagine a small population fraction suddenly switches for exogenous reasons by migration or mutation to something else, and we calculate on average how much payoff they earn compared to the first ones. And evolutionary stability means that you should always earn more on average than those mutants if they are few enough. So it's very close to John Nash, but not exactly the same thing. A bit more demanding. Now, we want to do this at the level of goal functions or utility functions. So now we move from strategies to goals. How can one do that? Well, we suggest the following. So we just take the paradigm, the idea, but lift it up one level. So we imagine now a goal function. Suppose people have this goal function, these moral values, this whatever, envy, whatever it is, or material interest, and they walk around there and they now and then interact as in the other case, right? But now we imagine that a few people maybe have some other moral values or some other preferences, maybe by migration or mutation, they see something happening on TV or whatever, some source like that, some exogenous source. Those few people do that, and they might bump into each other or not, but they will not know who is a mutant or not. You don't know if this guy has this new mutant value function or he has my old resident value function. How shall we then evaluate how they fare? Well, we thought that the most natural thing is to say, let's look at all Nash equilibria under incomplete information. So look at the equilibrium where people play against the randomly drawn opponents. They don't know who they are, but they behave as if they understood the statistics. What is the frequency of people I typically meet? And what should I then best do? So we say then that a strategy, or I'm sorry, a utility function or goal function is evolutionary stable against another one if the other one comes in small enough population shares in all Nash equilibria under incomplete information, all Bayesian equilibria, the first ones on average do better in material outcomes than the second. Maybe they have other motives, maybe they have particular motives for doing what they are doing, maybe they're altruistic, but what counts then is the material outcome in all equilibria. So we ask then that they should do better in all Nash equilibria than the incumbent, than the mutant. And that is, we require that to hold for all goal functions, all continuous functions that are behaviorally distinct. Because of course, as you realize as studying economics, that you can have different goal functions and yet behave the same way. So for example, my goal function maybe is 1/2 of your goal function, then we will always behave the same, or I add a constant and so on. So we have to modulo behavioral differentiation. So that is the definition of stability, which is quite demanding then. But we also thought we will have a demanding definition of instability. So usually you would say, yeah, well, if we call it unstable if it is not stable. But we say that by instability we mean something, particularly weakness, so to pinpoint here. So instability of a goal function or preference or moral value is if there, no matter how small population fractions I think about, there will be some equilibrium with such few people coming in, and if they have their alternative goal functions, they actually do better in some Nash equilibrium under incomplete information, always under incomplete information. And so therefore you could say that, well, that means that instability is something that can happen if there is a particular type that could invade in some sense. It could come in a small population share, either by migration or by perturbation of values in society in a small group. And the criterion is, as long as they are few, they do better in some equilibrium. It could happen there and they would do materially better. That is the definition. Now, using these definitions, we need to specify how do they meet. I didn't say anything. I just said they randomly bump into each other. We will assume random associative matching. So there is a population. We draw n individuals randomly, maybe uniformly, but it could be associatively. So it could be that we have geographic structure, for example, is more likely that people living near each other are interacting with each other. Or it could be culture, it could be language, it could be profession, it could be anything. So there is some social structure behind here, if you like, a social network, which we take as exogenous. We cannot vary that. We say, suppose there is such a pattern, so that there is some correlation between who you meet and who you are. So it's more likely that we meet here because we are at PSC and we like economics and we speak some English and some French and so on, right? And so forth. So if you do that, then we say the only thing we need to know about the social network is the associativity profile, as we call it. So it just what it has to say is a probability vector that says, given that if I would be a mutant, what is the likely? How many do I expect in my group I'm interacting with? N people, so n minus 1 other guys are also mutants. Okay, if it's a very local society, like let's say siblings, that is the case we started with. So I'm interacting with a sibling, and suppose we inherited our values from our parents with equal probability for father and mother. Then if I'm a mutant, the probability that my sibling is also a mutant is 1/2. Even if the population share of such mutants is very low, so epsilon is very small, but given that I'm a mutant and it comes from somewhere, it's very likely that at least one of my parents had that mutant gene or mutant value, mutant cultural value, whatever language, whatever you want to call it. And hence, this is 1/2 then. So that is an example from biology. You could also imagine cultural patterns where smaller groups interact and something new comes up, it spreads. So a PSC could be such a node where ideas spread, good ideas spread. And then people who are connected with PSC through whatever, either being working here or other sources, will then be influenced more likely than people who have no connection with PSC. So this is the way we represent the structure of society here. Now, here is the result, and that's it. Now, after this, you can actually go to sleep if you like. I will try to explain what it says also, of course, so I hope you will keep awake. The result is that there is a particular class of goal functions that comes out very strongly. We call them Homo Moralis, and I will explain what they are. I started just by stating the result. Homo Moralis with morality profile mu equal to A, so A was the given associativity profile of the social network, is evolutionary stable. Any preferences that are behaviorally distinct from that are unstable. So for example, if there is some positive associativity in a social network, we will then Homo economicus will be unstable. If A has positive components, selfishness is not stable. Some other function is stable. Now, what is now Homo Moralis? And I will now try to explain that first informally and then a little bit more formally. So Homo Moralis, you can think of Homo Moralis as being a creature who thinks about self-interest in an interaction, forms expectations about what other people are doing, try to do best, but also thinks about what is the right thing to do. And when we say right thing to do, it is in line with Immanuel Kant. So it's a hypothetical scenario. What happens if others would do like I'm doing now? Is that a good thing? Do I think it's a right act? Should I take the car now when I could have walked and now I pollute and so on or whatever? You know, these kind of thoughts we have. If you throw garbage in the street, Kant said, well, you should only do it if you think it's a good idea. That should be a general law that people should throw garbage in the street and so on. And that is the flavor of this. Here is good old Immanuel Kant. I studied philosophy when I was young. I studied actually physics, theoretical physics and mathematics is my background. And I studied on the side philosophy. I was quite interested and I read many philosophers, including Immanuel Kant, and thought that was really fascinating moral philosophy. And then when I moved to economics, I thought I will probably never see this again, because economics was based so much on self-interest and consequentialism. And here is something which is very different in flavor. So it was with a great surprise that in the equations, when we were solving for stability, we saw equations we can interpret in line with Immanuel Kant. His book is from 1785, the same year as Condorcet's book, by the way. So it's just before the French Revolution, these guys were thinking. And this maxim of Kant is well known. There are different varieties of this kind of maxim in all cultures and all religions. Golden rules and so on, they're slightly different in their formulation. And what we find is closest to a generalization of this. We have a probabilistic generalization of this principle in our paper. So let's take pairwise interaction. Pairwise interactions are the easiest because you don't have to think about correlation between other guys' types when you are in a group. There are only you and another guy. And you don't know the other guy's type. So what is Homo Morality then? Homo Morality then is a guy who has utility function U of own strategy X. That's maybe a plan to do something during the next few months when I'm interacting with the other guy. Y is the other guy's strategy, also similarly defined. And then pi is now the material outcome, so the profit if I'm a firm or some other material outcome, which could be fitness in biology or well-being for a human or something like that. Now it says this is a goal function, which is a linear combination, a convex combination. It gives some non-negative weight to each goal. Self-interest, pi xy, that is what Homo economicus would do. What is my self-interest here? My profit. And then it says something else, pi xx, and that is an exotic term, right, that we haven't seen in economics before. What does it mean? Well, the interpretation is, if I want to maximize pi xx, it means I should take an action such that if everybody would do like I do, so the guy who I meet also does x, that would be the best thing to do. So that is what I would do, irrespective of what the other guy does. So that is that would be what we interpret then as an example of Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. I should take an action, I should contribute to the public good as much as I think everybody should do. If I give weight 100% to that, then I'm Homo Kantiensis. Homo Kantiensis is a purely moral person, very difficult actually. We have examples when you don't want to interact with Homo Kantiensis because he's very strict. And he's not stable. He will not be stable in any scenario. The opposite is Adam Smith type, a selfish guy who gives weight 1 to pi xy. He expects y to be done, then he should do the x that maximizes that number, right? And we say, actually, that some weight should be given to each of them. And the theorem says, in a given social network, the weight should be tailored exactly by the associativity profile of the social network. So the type correlation matrix. So this means there is a continuum of types here from self-interest to full morality, in this case with two guys. Now, if there are more than two guys, it's a little bit more involved. So here is an expression for the general Homo Moralis. It says, okay, you are this guy, and you have utility function Ux of your strategy, which might be a complicated thing, saying what you should do over 100 days, given information and everything. You meet n-1 other guys, and y, a boldface there, is a vector which says for everybody a strategy. Okay, suppose you meet these guys and you expect y, what would you like to do? If you're Homo Moralis, you don't maximize just pi of x, y. You want to maximize the expected value of pi x capital Y, where capital Y is a random variable that for each component either takes the value yj for that other guy j, or your value x. So you replace them randomly, and you take an expectation. If it's a game with a lot of people in, so n is very large, you could say, roughly speaking, you treat it as if the fraction n of those guys randomly picked will actually do what I'm doing instead of what y says. Okay. So again, we get then Homo economicus as one special case, and Homo Kantiensis as the opposite special case when you do the right thing. Now, the proof by these are for the result. So why is Homo Moralis the right degree of morality stable, and why are other preferences not, can be given some intuition. So it's essentially, the argument is not that Homo Moralis has preferences which are good for the group. Like group selection, I should do what's good for the group. That's not at all the case. It is instead the following reasoning, if you like, behind it. It says, strategy should be used such that it makes life as hard as possible for any other goal function to come into society in a small group in terms of material outcomes, so that we should have such preferences so that when we interact with each other without any mutations, the best a mutant can do is to mimic us. There is no other way to earn more material payoff in any equilibrium. So it's preemption. So preparedness for there can be a shock and people can be correlated in their interactions, and we do that. What is preventing that? That is stability. I mean, so this is a stability argument, not a welfare argument. That is what is stable. What about instability? So suppose there is a population and they have some other goal function that doesn't always do this. Well, then one can show that, okay, so there is some equilibrium where they do something where there is a better strategy to do if a few enough people do it. So most people do this, whatever they are doing. A few guys come in there, and suppose now that they do something else, we can show that will exist some better reply in terms of material outcomes. Maybe these are altruistic guys, naive Swedes living there, right? And here comes a selfish guy. And the selfish guy then maybe have a better strategy, earn more material payoff in some equilibrium interacting with the Swedes. Then that means that the Swedish preferences are not stable. Okay, so that is the logic. So one can find a mutant that can invade, and it is as if the mutant were committed to some behavior. That is the easiest way to prove this. So I will not go into any more detail here, but that's the flavor of the thing. So we haven't seen these preferences discussed before in economics, and we are now curious to see, can you find any trace of this in human behavior, and what would be the implications if we would do economic analysis based on such preferences? So let me now briefly talk about experiments. Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
I'm a bit puzzled by the tension between the European systems on material payoff, the gap, and the fact that your choice function can be very different from
yes. Right. So that what we imagine here is that there is some material outcome that drives, who will survive in the long run, who will be around there. So it could either be firms, and earning more profits, they are more likely to be around, or when it comes to human interactions, we don't say where it comes from. If there is something, maybe a behavior which then enhances your well-being in some sense, that your happiness or your well-being or something like that, and that's something we take for granted. We suppose, and that is, we suppose there is something there which would be like fitness, which matters for your survival and so on. And if that is what, if those who have better values there will be emulated by others, either by biological or imitation or cultural values, so they see that you're doing better, you're more likely to be followed in the next generation than if you're doing worse. I mean, so that is an assumption.
The better and worse is not in terms of
No, it's material payoff, because we say that if it is the case that you will be exactly. So that's very important what you point out, because there must be some machinery which is biological or some kind of selection mechanism works on something which is kind of physical, if you like, in some sense. Then one question is, what are our subjective valuations? How do we behave? As if we cared only about that, or we cared about something else. So you're right, one has to specify that. And then the reason why there is, some other factors coming in here has to do with this preemption. So if there is a society which is very localized, so there are small communities and so on, then if you're a mutant, it's quite likely that there is somebody else also here who also learned from Paris School of Economics. This is a new way of thinking, right? And therefore, this is in the self-interest of the goal function, if you see. So if you think about the selfish gene, you remember Richard Dawkins' book on the selfish gene, this will be like a selfish goal function. Goal functions use us as carriers. We are just the machines. There is software here, and the software just used temporarily me. I'm an old computer. I will be replaced by younger soon, and so on. And and many of you are young here, and you are developing your human capital and so on. So imagine that you can think of it from the viewpoint of the goal functions. They use carriers, and if the carrier is doing well, so that it can survive and meet other people, not starve to death and so on, then it will be around, and then you will see it spread. So it's a self-interest of the goal function, if you see, and it uses us. So selfishness could be using us, religious beliefs could be using us, and so on. They use us as vehicles for promoting themselves, in some sense. Yeah. Any other question? Yes?
Give a bit of intuition as to why the selfish preference is not stable?
Mm-hmm. That is because of this preemption. So suppose we live in a world which is very large and there is no social structure, so everybody is equally likely to meet anybody else. So we are on eBay or some enormously big financial market or something like that. Then you will get Homo economicus as a special case, because then the assortativity profile will be that you almost never would, if you're a mutant, you can neglect any other mutants in that case because you're randomly matched to somebody, and therefore self-interest in a uniform random matching comes out. And this is a result we have already seen in theoretical work, right? That's Darwinian natural selection leads to self-interest if we have no structure on the population. What this says, if there is a structure, however, that is not true. So suppose that there are selfish people living in a society which has some structure. So there are local unities like firms or villages or languages and cultures. Now, it will not be immune against invasion by some people who care a little bit about each other or something else, because they could sometimes 2 or 3 of them are there in this society of 10 people or something like that, and they will actually be doing better. So they will then locally and temporarily make a better living.
Yeah, one clarification question. So when there is a share of mutants with some modifying goals, you said you look at the Nash-based equilibrium, so you have in mind that people are aware of the distribution of types?
No.
What's the rationale for the...
Thank you for a good question. I got the same question from Cédric Villani once. And Cédric, we have since then been in contact, and he's now a candidate, as you know, for the elections. So I thought that was one. So the question is, what about cognitive capacity? You could, of course, imagine situations when these individuals have high cognitive capacity and they understand a lot of things. But that is not really the gist of the argument. The argument is it shouldn't be so that there should exist a Nash equilibrium in which the mutants do better. That could mean that you can figure out what are the Nash equilibria, but it could also mean that society shouldn't be able to land in a situation where the population were drifting, maybe by just bounded learning. If they were drifting towards some Nash equilibrium, and they were, then they would be doing as best as they could. You couldn't improve your behavior given that Nash equilibrium. And we say that.
Okay, so you use the shortcut of evolutionary economics to not justify Nash.
Yeah, there should not be any Nash. At least, I mean, you could say you could have other criteria. Actually, we could replace Nash with other criteria. We have something that should be consistent, and we say that shouldn't be able to happen, and that people could learn to do that. Maybe boundedly rational. One can make a stronger or weaker machinery here. So one could say, so if I now speak just for a minute mathematics, what it has to do with this here is upper hemicontinuity. So this is actually completely topological result. And the Nash equilibrium correspondence is upper hemicontinuous, and that is what makes it work. We also know, for example, that sequential equilibrium correspondence is also upper hemicontinuous, so one could use that. One could also think about something else. One could say, talk about some kind of rationalizability and then study that. So, I mean, so there is a variety here. We chose Nash because we wanted to communicate with us, among us economists and so on. We think that would be the benchmark. At least there shouldn't be any Nash equilibrium. Yeah. Yes?
It seems to me that in the goal function of a Homo Moralis, there is a kind of taste for conformity.
Not necessarily, yeah. No, not necessarily. That's a very good question. Sometimes it will be the same thing, that you want to do what others are doing. But suppose others are doing something which you think is not the right thing to do. We are living in a world, I take now a stark example. Suppose we have a coordination game. We have a bad equilibrium. We are all sitting there. We're doing this bad thing whenever we meet, but that's an equilibrium. So I don't want to deviate unilaterally myself. Right? And there is potentially a good equilibrium. The bad equilibrium is unemployment. I don't hire people because they, and so on, and I cannot sell because they are unemployed and blah, blah, blah. Right? So you can get stuck in a bad equilibrium. There could be another equilibrium for the same economy, which is a much higher activity. But being a firm, I don't dare to employ anybody if I'm in the bad equilibrium and so on, right? And then you could say conformity would then say that, okay, I should do what the others are doing also. That doesn't contradict self-interest. Self-interest and conformity go in the same direction. But if you would ask Immanuel Kant come now, and suppose I take Homo Kantiensis, a very moralistic guy, then he would not play along that equilibrium. He'd say, I will hire a lot of guys. I understand I will make a loss, but that's the right thing to do. We should all hire people, and then they get the economy going. So he will not be conformistic. He will be quite difficult. I mean, so if he matches then with some other party in a trade, then the other party will miscoordinate, of course, right? So there can be a loss locally, a local and temporary loss for other people to interact with this moralistic guy. And we find that neither of them is evolutionarily stable, neither pure self-interest nor pure morality in a society where there is some structure. And in that case, we will get this. Yeah. So it's not conformity. Sometimes it will be the same thing, sometimes not. Thank you. So I proceed now, and now I take the second question. What about, can one see any traces of this? So as I mentioned, Ernst Fehr and I and Michael Kosfeld many years ago ran an experiment in Zurich with about 100 master students from ETH and Zurich University. We let them play a sequential prisoner's dilemma, which means that we said to the people, you are now randomly matched with another guy from this group, and we will not tell you who it is. You will either be called to be the first mover or the second. If you are the first mover, you have to choose between two actions, and we can call them cooperate or defect if you like. We didn't call them like that. If you're the second mover, you will learn what the first guy did, and then you can react to that. So you can reciprocate if you like, or you can do whatever you like. So that is what we started, and we were quite concerned then that we wanted to control for beliefs, because when you do revealed preference theory in consumer theory, you don't have to think so much about the beliefs. To some extent, of course, the health consequences of food, for example. But in a game, it's really very important what you believe others do. For example, maybe I'm the first mover, maybe I'm a selfish guy, but I think if I would cooperate, the other guys are so nice here, so they will cooperate with me now, and otherwise they would defect. So then I would cooperate for self-interest. So we want to distinguish that from the true motive. How do we do that? We ask people to say, what do you think is the probability that the respondent will react with cooperation if you cooperate as a first mover, or with defect as a first mover? And then we rewarded them. So we said, we will look at the average, actually, frequency of responses here, and we will give you a quadratic reward, quadratic distance from this payment. So that is what we did. So we asked people, and it turned out that they had pretty good, on average, pretty good beliefs about each other, but there was systematic biases. And I don't have time to talk about that now, but you can read the paper if you like. So here is the game, you're called to be player 1 or player 2. So now this is a game in the class we talked about, because we imagine this as one part of a game where first there is a coin toss, and then it says you are player 1 or you are player 2. Then a strategy for you is, what will I do if I'm player 1? Will I play C or D or randomize? If I'm player 2 and I see the other guy doing either C or D, what will I do? So this is a game now which has this aggregative feature, although it's sequential, because we embed it in a coin that is being tossed. Now, we did that, and then what we did, we said, okay, let's try 5 goal functions here in the literature. One is Homo economicus, just if you want to maximize your winnings on this, they get money from playing this game. Do you place positive value to the earnings of the other guy? So you care about the other guy? Are you inequity averse in the sense of Fehr and Schmidt? So you like your own payoff, but you dislike differences in payoffs, in particular when it's to your disadvantage. That's Fehr-Schmidt. Charnes and Raven have a more complex model that actually nests much of this, but we focus on what differs from Fehr and Schmidt, which mean a conditional concern for welfare. So you care more about welfare, about the well-being of the other guy, if you are better off than if you're worse off. So this is a slightly different model. And then Homo Moralis. Okay, how many parameters? Homo economics, 0 parameter, we just take the raw data. Altruism, 1 parameter, alpha, the weight you give to the other guy. Fehr-Schmidt, 2 parameters, how ill you feel when the other guy is doing better than you, and how ill you feel when you do better than the other guy. And conditional concern for welfare also has 2. How do you do and how do you think about welfare? In 2 ways. Homo Moralis, 1. Okay. So we were a bit nervous when we did this, and then we got the following result. That the hit rate, which means the percentage of subjects whose behavior are consistent with a model. So 28% of these students' behavior was consistent with Homo economicus. That is not very impressive, right, as a model of something. Altruism does better. So people, if you say that, okay, you are allowed to care about other people, and we then take the data and we take an alpha, which best fits the data, and say how much can we now present and how much is consistent, 44%. And then we took Fehr-Schmidt and got 60%. Then we took Charnes-Raven's model and we hacked it, then it hacks up to 82%. And then we took Homo Moralis and we got 83. So this is just a pilot study. It's very simple. I don't think this will be very robust. We can get different numbers, but what Ernst wrote to me, Jürgen, now you're happy, aren't you? And I said I'm happy, but I think it is just a methodology, and we must do this much more seriously, because of course there will be more experiments will show new things, but at least it shows, I think, Homo Moralis is somewhere there in the ballpark. It has explanatory power.
So how do you design assortative matching?
No assortative matching. We just say, suppose there has been some process of people in their mind, you are Homo Moralis, you have some kappa, we don't know your kappa. We try to see, are you behaving consistently with some kappa? If we try to explain that, how much can we explain? How many people can we explain? If we instead took inequity versions, we say you have some alpha and beta, like if you're Schmidt, how much behavior. You have said what you believe people will do. We take that seriously. And then we say, what did you do? Is it consistent with some alpha or some kappa?
So it's not testing your mechanism.
No, it's not testing the evolutionary, thank you. It's not testing the evolutionary mechanism. It just says, suppose people now, for some reason, historic reasons, individual histories, whatever, personality, have some kappa, and they behave according to Homo Moralis of some degree, which we don't know.
So which number do we get for the
we conditioned them. So this is a paper. You can read it. So what we did, we divided people up into their beliefs and what they did in categories, and then we estimated gave the best shot for each model, and we essentially. So I have to stop here, I think, for the interest of time. More work.
So you don't want to tell us
the parameter values.
So how much? Okay.
That I cannot tell you because we got a distribution, and we didn't do it. We had so little data. We cannot really say. We don't have Yeah. Well, I don't remember actually. I think it must be somewhere. Yeah. Okay. So we are now doing more experiments in Tilburg with Boris van Leuven. So we have much more data now. We haven't analyzed it yet, and we will see. And you are welcome to try this also. Now, so then I will be very short then. Yeah, maybe. So I will just mention these things. So then one can ask, what would happen then if we would use Homo Moralis model as a model for preferences, take the material payoffs of firms or of subjects in laboratory studies, and then add some kappa and so on and calculate. And I will be very brief here. So I think I will skip trust games. You know trust games, right? So one subject gets money and can divide any share with another guy, and if whatever he sends to the other guy. The first guy is called the investor. Whatever the investor sends to the second guy is multiplied by some magic, factor 3. And then the recipient can decide to keep all the money and go away. Homo economicus would do that, or return some fraction. Most people return some fraction, and most people trust. So this is then at variance with Homo economicus. And we just note that Homo Moralis would actually trust if morality is high enough, and would also be trustworthy if morality is high enough. So I will skip that. And then I will say that here is an extreme opposite case, environmental economics classical, Musgrave from the 50s and Ken Arrow from the 70s. Imagine a continuum population now, so a very large population, and suppose there is something like the climate or something else which matters. And suppose that climate depends only on consumption of good 2. So good 2 is a harmful good. The more we consume of that good, the worse is the environment, and we all like the environment. Good 1 is neutral, and everybody has a standard budget equation and so on. So that is what one could study now. So let's say that utility, and I write U here now, now I mean classical utility for consumption, leisure and whatever consumption is given by U. So it's how much I consume of the neutral good, X1, how much I consume of the harmful good, maybe riding the car and doing other things. X2 is the aggregate output use of that good. So that will be a negative effect on my utility of aggregate output because it gives pollution. If we do standard economics and we write up the first order equation for a consumer, and we imagine that the consumer has a morality parameter kappa, it becomes this first order condition. So the rate of substitution in utilities between good 2 and good 1 consumption should be equal to the price, right? In microeconomics textbooks. What this says, if there is a vector, if there is some mu, which mu is now the morality parameter for this, if this guy cares about what he's doing, there will be an extra term. Now note that U3 is the utility, the marginal utility of consumption, the aggregate consumption of 2, which harms the environment. That means it's negative. So that is actually a positive term. So it is moral people will act as if it was more expensive. The goods that are harmful are more expensive. And this is very different than Homo economicus wouldn't care because you cannot influence the environment, so you can do whatever you like. You can vote for environmental taxes, but you don't change your behavior. Even an environmentalist who is rational and not moralistic would not change their behavior. They would also take their car because their influence on the environment is nil. But if we care about what we are doing, and this is what Homo Morality does, you know, the act of doing it, my strategy, I care about my strategy, that changes things. So it's a deontological motivation, not a consequentialistic motivation. So that matters. Okay, so there are other interactions one can think about. I will stop here. So what we're doing then is suggesting that maybe evolutionary theory seems to suggest in a stylized, simplified mathematical framework that there are other components than self-interest coming up. And in this setting, we find something which we interpret as Kantian morality. And that means then we suggest that if we want to endow individuals with richer motivation than the classical economics motivations, we should of course keep the enormous powerful machinery of economics we have, which is great, but maybe we should then enlarge the motivations and make them richer. We should of course look at other things also like cognition, but we don't look at that now. So that what we obtain then is something which spans between self-interest and morality. And then, you know, if I write a model with an arbitrary kappa for everybody, that means I, as an economist, I have not taken a stand if people are selfish or moralistic. I don't know. So I just have a model which allows for anything there, and then it becomes an empirical question, the predictions I make. So it would mean then, as an economist, I don't have to say that I just believe in selfish people when I do my analysis. And that would be an empirical question. But the machinery is general. We have game theory, we have microeconomics, we have general equilibrium, wonderful things to work with. Thank you.
Maybe one final question. Okay, so I have to do a little thinking. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much. This was interesting. Towards the end, when you were showing this slide and showing that in your experiment, the behaviors were often compatible with very different motivations, the Kantian motivation and some other motivations. This reminded me of something that is going on in contemporary moral philosophy. People like Derek Parfit or John Bloom, they say that very different moral theories, some consequentialist, some totally deontological, some contractualist, they may converge in their moral implications, in their behavioral implications. So they recommend the same things, but for very different reasons. And could it be, that, well, either this is just a coincidence, this parallel between your last slide and that debate, or rather it could be that there is some serious underdetermination. But tell me, do you think that if you do more experiments, you will be able to distinguish and say people are in that sense moral and not in this sense, or do you think that this underdetermination will remain?
That's a very good question. We are of course concerned about this. In the new experiments we have been just running in children, we have intentionally designed the experiment such that we can differentiate. Here Schmidt would move in that direction. If you change the payoffs to this guy here, you would move in that direction, while Morales would move in that direction. So we tried, you know, one has to work hard, and sometimes it's very hard, because many times, as you say, it will result in the same thing. You know, if you say public goods, you know, a moral guy or a naturalistic guy, they will behave very much the same. However, if you look at some, so we have to work hard here to discriminate if we want to pinpoint what is the motivation. One difference between, say, altruists and morally motivated people is that altruists are easier to exploit. I can show that the best reply correspondence of an altruist is more sensitive to what other guys are doing. So the altruist will adapt more easily, and you can push the altruist to contribute to the public good. A moralist is harder, as you can imagine, a more stubborn guy. So they are less exploitable in some sense. But I mean, we need to work on this.
Okay, last question.
Quickly, just thinking if you thought about an extension. So the core here is that the pi function is independent of the type. While, you know, I might be interacting with somebody in a different environment, or we are different physical types which have different fitness functions. That seems crucial because the pi xx depends on that. So just that.
That's true, and that is what we think is the point we most of all want to generalize. What we can do is we can take a wheel of ignorance, and we say Mother Nature will endow you and me
from a typeset, but we are drawn from the same type distribution, like Karzheimer did, Rolls did, and so on. In that game, the meta game, we can do the same thing. But you're right. Yeah.